What's happening, everyone? Welcome to this episode of Corner Table Talk, Food plus Drink plus Culture. And today I am honored to welcome to the Corner Table Clarence Otis Jr. Clarence served as Chief Executive Officer of Darden Restaurants from 2004 to 2014 and was its chairman from 2005 to 2014. At the time, he was one of only 3 African Americans to be named CEO of a Fortune 500 company. Clarence joined Darden in 1995 as its treasurer. And for those of you that don't know, Darden is the world's largest restaurant operator in the full service space. Its brands include Olive Garden, Longhorn Steakhouse, the Capitol Grill, Seasons 52, Yard House, and at one time Red Lobster, which we will discuss with Clarence a little bit. He is a member of the New York Bar Association and began his professional career as a securities attorney in New York City. Clarence serves on multiple boards, including Verizon Communication, Danny Meyer's Union Square Hospitality. He's on the board of trustees of the Cleveland Clinic. And Clarence is the chairman of the board of Jazz at Lincoln Center, where I hear there's a pretty good restaurant called Tatiana. New York Times voted it the #1 restaurant last year. So props to Tatiana. He also sits on the board of the Boys and Girls Club of America. In 2021, Clarence and his wife Jacqueline opened the Jacqueline Bradley and Clarence Otis Family Branch Boys and Girls Club in Orlando, Florida. And he and Jacqueline also have one of the largest collections of African-American art in the country. So it is a distinct honor to welcome Clarence to Corner Table Talk. Before we get started, I want to give a shout out to my man, Eric Williams, who is the managing partner at the Stone Williams Group. Eric connected me with Clarence, so E, thank you very much. Clarence, let's jump in. Clarence, how you doing, man?
Good. How are you?
I'm excellent. Thank you. I just read in the New York Times, I think it was Sunday, how so many chefs now are feeling like restaurants are not where they want to be anymore. They don't want to open any more restaurants. And I'm curious from your standpoint, where do you see our industry right now? I mean, I know that you operated, and I believe that Darden they did not franchise. They were all company owned and company operated, but the independent restaurant, the small business that Kamala is talking about, I'm also, I come from that. I believe in that, but I think it's an endangered species. What's your take?
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear her talk about the focus on small business because I think it's important. I'll come back to that. And I think, with good intentions, a lot of public policymakers have promoted policies that really play to the strengths of the scale players. And really disadvantage the smaller players. And so you've talked about labor. A lot of that's driven by mandated wage rates.
Mm-hmm.
In California where you operate, that meant not just, a minimum wage, which makes sense to have a minimum wage, but expanding that minimum to tipped employees. Right. And you've got tipped employees who, without being at that minimum, say they're at $5, $6 an hour, the minimum is 15, they're making north of 15 already.
Right.
And so to bring their base up to 15 and layer tips on top of that is a mistake, mm-hmm. in my view. And it burdens restaurants, and small restaurants are not as able to absorb that kind of cost. And so it's good to see someone begin to talk about putting themselves in the shoes of that small business person. Labor's not the only thing.
Right.
You've got all kinds of regulations that are out there and they're piling on one another, and there's a cost attached to all of those. And again, as a small player, you don't have the levers to absorb that. As a large player like Darden, you can get more efficient in your supply chain. You can squeeze your suppliers who are big companies who can absorb some of that. So the credit card processors you can negotiate with, small businesses can't. They sort of take what they're given. The beverage companies, whether it's the Cokes and Pepsis of the world, or the beverage alcohol players like Constellation and Diageo. You can negotiate with them when you've got 2 or 3 thousand restaurants in a way that a small player can't. So all of that stuff, best of intentions, really advantages the bigger players, which is exactly what a lot of these policy players don't intend to do. They're anti-big. They're trying to promote smaller players, but they've got policies that don't do that. And so I think having someone step back and sort of look at that, not just for restaurants, but for small businesses across the board, is a good idea, because ultimately people talk about small business being the backbone of the country. And that's true, because even though a significant majority of the country works for large businesses, works for large not-for-profits, the governments and others, the dynamism of the economy comes from the fact that small businesses are being created and thriving, and they become big businesses. And that's what drives the economic health of the country. The fact that Google could go from being a tiny business to a big business, the fact that Meta could do the same thing. And so when you're limiting small business creation, you're limiting the future, because you're not going to get those large companies coming out of these startups.
Right. Large companies don't start out large, typically, to your point.
Exactly. So if you look at a Darden even, I mean,
Mhm.
Darden has been acquisitive, and Eddie V's is one of the brands. We acquired Eddie V's when they were 6, and now there's 6. I mean, that's what makes the country.
Yeah.
Yard House we acquired, I don't know, there were probably 60 or 70, now there are a couple hundred. That's what creates the dynamism in the U.S. economy.
Clarence, you heard a lot of talk about how unfriendly California is to business. Now, you've got a former business owner as a governor in Gavin Newsom, so that seems a little counterintuitive, but there are some problems with trying to do business in California. I remember when we, as small independent operators, owner operators, were trying to lobby against the minimum wage. We would show up at City Hall, our 10 or 15 strong, and 2,000 union members would come in, and, we'd just be drowned out. My question to you is, when you look at California, is it fair to be critical of the state, or Los Angeles specifically, as an unfriendly state or city to do business in? Is that criticism fair?
Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, when I look at the state, you basically have overregulation, just too many regulations. And in fact, some of that I would attribute quite candidly to the power of the plaintiff's bar. In retail, there's so many wage and hour regs that it's very difficult to comply with all of them. And so companies will find themselves out of compliance and facing a class action suit for some really minor thing that doesn't really matter to anyone. But you've got these regs that the plaintiff's bar has convinced the state legislature to put in place, and then you settle these class actions for nuisance value. But the nuisance value is $2-3 million. 80% of that goes to the lawyers that put together the case. And so that's just a tax. Every retailer knows that they've got to pay that kind of tax. Every of the major retailers, every other year, every 2 years. Those kinds of things are just business unfriendly. And there's no other way to characterize them. There's no other state that comes close to that. That's just the most obvious example of what sets California apart. Then I think the other is around land use. And land use regs are important. I grew up in California. I grew up in Los Angeles, as you've said. I've seen LA go from, when I was growing up there, the city was probably 2 million people. It was the third largest city, trailed Chicago. Now it's 4. The county may have been 4 or 5 million people. Now it's 11. And that explosion in population, without appropriate guardrails has resulted in, an ecological catastrophe. When I look at LA, and think about what it looked like when I grew up, and I look at how it's been cemented over, there's, you don't have to be an environmentalist to say this was a disaster. So you need regs,
Right.
but I think they've gone too far to the other side. And so now you actually have regulations that get in the way of solving the issues you need to solve, whether it's business or affordable housing. I mean, I'll tell you a story, because I stay in contact. I got lots of friends and family still in Los Angeles. I went back to my 50th high school reunion last year. And it was in the south side of the city, so at a metro, Vermont, south of El Segundo. Light commercial, Mitsubishi, a lot of very high-end companies, very clean, good hotel. On Vermont, you had people living in campers and RVs, and yet there's open land everywhere. And no neighbors to complain about affordable housing, but there's no affordable housing. That is a product of the overregulation from a land use perspective. Right. You've got this open land, you've got people living on this land, just on the streets instead of the vacant lots that abut the streets that could be affordable housing. And just that to me was a sad statement. Now, all that said, I mean, I would still be bullish on the future of California and Los Angeles. The folks on the right politically have been forecasting demise of California for decades, and that just hasn't happened. I mean, businesses leave, people leave, but other people come. I mean, I talked about the growth in the city and in the county, and that comes despite the fact that, a significant percentage of the folks that I went to high school with moved out of the state, but they got replaced. And they are the folks that fuel the growth of Las Vegas and Phoenix, just to name a couple of cities.
We talk about where are the cost savings going to come from? Where are we going to be able to improve our efficiencies so that we might be able to make a living again at this profession? AI, of course, technology is a place we all have to look at for that. How do you see AI and technology impacting hospitality? Or are we talking about jobs being lost? Is that an unintended consequence, or where do you think it's gonna hit us?
The place where it'll hit quickest is in the back office functions, and so all of the time consuming stuff that we do around receiving goods, in the restaurant, and all the labor hours that come in to getting stuff off the truck and, making sure it's the right stuff and put in the restaurant in the right places. AI will take control of that process. And so you'll have a lot fewer people, and that will be a lot more automated. And so will generating schedules and managing hours and all that stuff, forecasting of, food and beverage needs, all of that will. And so that probably means you can run a restaurant with fewer management employees for sure. So at an Olive Garden, you've got a general manager and 3 managers. You're probably talking about, a couple of managers and a key employee, because a lot of
less time in the office.
A lot of that will go away. I do think also the in-restaurant experience will change. And people who want a faster experience will be able to get it. And so they'll, you've already got people able to check out on their phone and all of that. All of that will get even more seamless. And so ordering ahead for the really casual restaurants. And so you'll have someone that's able to work a few more tables in a restaurant. As you know, checking people out is where a significant amount of time is spent. So I think there will be fewer direct labor hours, for sure. the applications behind all of this stuff will generate new jobs in different places, not in the restaurant, but attached. They're related to the restaurant industry.
Interesting. What about what we see? I've seen some of these hamburger flipping robots in the back of the house. I mean, do you think that we're headed there where we're going to be making, steak as a robot is going to be making
Yeah,
steaks in
I don't
restaurants?
know that they'll be doing the cooking, but a lot of it, is prep work. It starts
Mhm.
in some of these restaurants that are only open for lunch and dinner. The prep work starts at 6 in the morning. That prep work
Right.
will definitely be automated. So all of the slicing and dicing and bagging and soup making, but on the line during peak hours, probably not.
All right. So our line cooks can rest easy.
But all the
They can
prep
rest easy
workers,
for
yeah,
the moment.
that's gonna definitely thin out.
Yeah. 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 As I mentioned, we're coming up on an election. We're still feeling these headwinds in the economy. Of course, everybody feels like prices are too high. And just thinking again in terms of hospitality and restaurants, when do you see the tide kind of turning, consumer spending relaxing a bit? Is it post-election? Does it matter who gets elected? Clarence, what do you think we're looking at in terms of anything improving in the coming
I do
months?
think that there's some nervousness on the part of consumers, apprehension about spending because of the uncertainty associated with the election. Because when you look at the economic picture, you would expect that spending would be a little more robust than it is, in fact,
Right.
because
Stock market
and the
record.
job market.
Right.
I mean, people are employed.
Hmm.
Usually, as you know, as long as people are employed, die now. And so the
Yeah.
fact that we've got this slowdown despite these strong employment numbers, and not just strong employment numbers, but even with the inflation, wage growth numbers that we haven't seen in 10, 15 years. And
Hmm.
so you would expect a more robust spending environment, but I think this uncertainty around the election is definitely weighing on that. So to the extent the job market
Hmm.
continues to be reasonably solid after the election, I think we will get a little bit of lift among consumers on the in retail and in restaurants.
All right. Very good. So we'll hold on. I want to switch gears a little bit because I am, just really fascinated by your upbringing. As I mentioned, you were born in Mississippi. Your folks moved up to South Los Angeles when you were 7. If
Earlier, yeah, 4. I was 4. I started school in California.
Okay. I'm curious, coming from Mississippi to South LA is not necessarily a Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. What would you say you experienced as a young person in Watts? What were your early impressions of South Los Angeles?
A lot of it was wondering why uh, it was so poorly kept. Right.
Mm.
You know that the neighborhood's poor. People don't have a lot of money, just like my family, working class people. And people would keep their places up, keep their yards up, but the streets were just unkempt. And
Mhm.
my father in the house, we could travel around the city, see the other parts of the city, and no, it wasn't that way everywhere. So it was just wondering why, when you know the government represents the whole city, this part is kept at this level from an appearance perspective, and why it's just kept at this level. And just feeling innately that there was unfairness, that was just unfair. It had a couple of things that came out of that. It was coming at the time of the Black Power movement, and it accelerated that. And so Nation of Islam was big in LA early mid 60s. You had the Panthers, which was also big coming out of Oakland and the Bay Area, but having a big influence.
Mhm.
And so reinforcing this notion with political rhetoric and narrative, this isn't fair. We're not being treated fairly.
Mhm.
Whether it's the way our neighborhoods are kept, whether it's the police presence, the police engagement. So that notion of
Mhm.
unfairness was always a big part of it. You knew the world wasn't fair. But there was also this sense that you could change that. Right. So that was part of the Black Power piece as well. But the Black Power movement was accompanied by this Black arts with relatively politically charged, socially charged theater and visual arts and dance, and this notion that if we could marshal our cultural resources and take control of the political leadership of our communities, we could change. And so there was this sense that you could make stuff happen. That was reinforced by the fact that because the Watch Riot was the first major riot of the period, when Johnson developed his war on poverty, we were disproportionate beneficiaries because this all happened 2 years before Detroit or Newark. And so the number of government programs, uplift programs, the acronyms, Team Post, the CCC, the Neighborhood Youth Corps, on and on. And you could participate in all of those programs as a kid in elementary school or middle school. And my mother, she would sign up for all of them. She was a fairly active in the community. My father, less so, he worked. She did not work out of the house. And so we were engaged in all of those uplift programs and enrichment programs and all of these volunteers with all these expertises taking an interest in us. So it was definitely this notion that it's unfair, but you can change it. And there's opportunity for you that didn't exist before. So that was the general vibe. Yeah. Now, in addition to that, you had the beginnings of organized crime in the neighborhood, starting with youth gangs that were not commercial. It was just territorial. It was Boys in the Hood is almost a documentary of how that was. Over time, those gangs became commercial with drug distribution and other stuff.
I want to pause on that for a second because, I had seen some pretty rough neighborhoods. I remember Harlem in the 70s and the drug trade and the burned out brownstones and, how dangerous it could be uptown. But man, when I went through Nickerson Gardens, I had never seen anything like that. I didn't think that a place like that could exist in America. And just to put a fine point for our listeners on the neighborhood that you grew up in, I read that one of the founders of the Crips you went to school with. How did you avoid that? I know you said you were a student athlete and your mom obviously had you involved in programs and stuff, but the temptation, the challenges, the danger, that was everywhere, man. How did you come through that? What kept you away from it?
Well, I think it was a relatively small subset that were really gangbangers. So this notion that, you get recruited and if you're not in the gang, that's a problem. That's not true. That flips the numbers. When I was growing up, maybe 25% of the young guys in the neighborhood were gangbangers. The others were not. They found other stuff, whether it was academics or sports or arts, and that's what they did. And the guys who were in the gangs, you went to elementary school with, you knew them from day one. So they were not a threat to you. They were friends and not enemies. And so Wayne Day is the guy, and Wayne's still alive, and Wayne has his own Wikipedia page, so people can look him up. But so
I tried.
I did. Wayne and I went to elementary school. We played, touch football on the asphalt, and we knew each other. And so that was never a problem. The same thing, and Wayne was the Jordan Downs. And Jordan Downs, another housing project, like the Nickersons. There were 3. Jordan Downs, Nickerson, Imperial Courts. We stayed close. Our house was closest to the Imperial Courts. But my high school was Jordan High School, right next to the Jordan Downs, and then Nickerson's was over there. And the Nickerson's, Herman Coleman, another guy, Herman was a defensive back. He played defensive back. I played linebacker. Herman was a founder of Bounty Hunters, which ultimately became the Bloods. But Herman's brother, John was the city high school player of the year in football, running back, went to Rice. So even in one family, you're gonna get different paths. The Colemans exemplified that because John was an academic all-around, and a full ride to Rice, and Herman's been in and out of prison his entire life. So you could make those choices. You just couldn't venture out of your space into another space where you didn't go to elementary school with those guys. You didn't go to junior high school with them. That's where it got dangerous. And the same thing, people that didn't grow up in our neighborhood couldn't come in there and feel as safe as we felt.
Yeah, it's just the odds, the odds of making it through all of that. Just wow, a lot to think about. I want to read a quote from you about your dad, and then talk about him just a little bit. You said, quote, "My dad got a job working for the city of LA as a custodian, a janitor. He had a serious work ethic. He believed in working. There was a 10-year period there from about 1965 to 1975 when he worked 2 full-time jobs at once. The off days didn't overlap. So there were 4 days a week when he worked 8 hours and 3 days a week where he worked 16 hours. We're the same age. I don't, my dad was born in 1925. His family was from Georgia. I don't know, what year your dad was born, but I would imagine, probably about that generation. And I'm really fascinated by the Black men that came through what they came through and worked the jobs they did and sacrificed the way that they did. Could you talk a little bit about your father, Clarence, and what kind of relationship you had with him?
Yeah. And I would say, it really is a generation because it was not just him, but it was all his friends. They were all pretty much the same kind of guy from a work ethic perspective. They all had different personalities and different family lives, but they just felt like they had to put in the hours because that's the kind of work they had to do. They weren't doing knowledge. They weren't knowledge laborers. That wasn't what they were afforded, given when they grew up and where they grew up. And even the folks that did have a knowledge worker job needed to supplement it. So I think about my father-in-law, who did graduate from college, that same generation, and was a high school or junior high school teacher, then assistant principal, then principal. He still worked at the post office as a side hustle to bring in income. But my father was the oldest of 12. His mother had him when she was like 15 years old. Parents weren't married, raised, as you would imagine, given that, a lot by his grandmother, then, bounce around. His mother gets married, his stepfather, then they're very close. So he's very close to, he's the only one, and then he has 11 stepbrothers and sisters, but they're all close, and his stepfather is his guy. But he grew up bouncing around in Mississippi, so he didn't have the ability to pursue a formal education past about 13 years old. But when he was in school, he was A student, so he wasn't that he was a poor student. He just stopped. And so that explains so he was able, he was fortunate, he was blessed. He's a janitor, but he's a janitor for the city of Los Angeles, which meant he was a civil servant. And so being a good student, he could just study for civil service exams and keep getting promoted. You pass the exam, you get to the next level. And so eventually he was running custodial services for about a third of LAX. And making a good living. So he was able to just bootstrap because he had the good fortune of working as a civil servant. So I respect civil service. I respect unions. His public employee union was important. in his journey. He looked out for other folks. Like I said, my mother was pretty active in the community. I mean, the most striking part of Boys in the Hood, when I look at that, I said it's a documentary. It's the scene where Lawrence Fishburne's playing the dad. The cops come along, they're treating one of the kids unfairly. He just takes his son Trey, and they step away from you. That's my father would have been all over that. He would have been all over the cops because they're just civil servants too. And so he had no fear of government. And that was the one discordant note in that film. It's like, no, he's not going to let them just
That's
walk
an interesting
walk
nuance.
some
Yeah.
teenagers away.
Yeah.
He was an ex-Marine, which is how we got to California, because he was stationed at Pendleton, which is down between LA and San Diego, closer to San Diego. That's where he decided he wanted to come back to Southern California. So that kind of a guy, nonsense, but not strict. We didn't grow up in a really strict household. Our parents, I mean, when I was in high school, I shouldn't say this, but our curfew was like 2 a.m. because that's when everything closed.
Wow.
But it wasn't midnight. It wasn't 11. It was 2 a.m. So they were fairly, I think about it today and I think, wow, they were really liberal parents.
Yeah, kind of lenient. Well, let's talk about you as a dad. I know you have two sons and a daughter. And to whom much is given, much is expected, right? So, your sons look at their dad as this accomplished person. I followed in my dad's footsteps into the same business, and at some point felt the need to step out from his shadow and really establish myself. How do you view being a dad to two sons and with the pressure that may come from being the sons of Clarence Otis?
Well, I think we tried hard to make sure that we understand what they really have passion for, and to help them understand that they have a wide range of motion, that they can pursue what they're interested in. That's one of the blessings that they have. So it's not so much about trying to repeat what we've done and seeing that as what success looks like. It's more about, what do you really, really, really want to do? Because you have the option to do it. Our parents have those options. And we didn't have that many. We had to ultimately build them well. And so we were limited in terms of the things we could pursue. They don't have those limitations. And so that's been part of it.
Love that. I love that. I want to switch over just briefly because I feel like, a lot of attention gets focused, especially after 2020 and George Floyd, on the number of Black CEOs at big companies and Fortune 500 companies. And, you've talked about that. Of course, you were one of three at the time. And then, there were eight, and now I think there are eight now. But I read something where you said, and I think that's, 1.5% of Fortune 500 companies that are the African-American CEOs. But you said something interesting that I wanted to touch on. And you said that not enough attention was focused on at the Russell 500, that, if you, 2000, I'm sorry, if you look at that, you have more Black CEOs than you probably have had at any time in history. And I'm curious, when at that, the position of CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and we know, of course, historically there's been little representation. What do you see from there, Clarence? What's your purview, and why are we so underrepresented? And what was your view from there that generally that you could just share?
I guess what I saw was there is a pace, that exists, and you can't really break it. We didn't really, as a community, Black folks, didn't start to go to the schools that the business world sourced talent from until the late 60s. at the earliest, maybe even early 70s. And this is not, they're not talking about Ivy League, but just majority schools, whether that's SUNY Purchase or Harvard or UCSD or UCLA or Stanford, or any of them, University of Colorado. We didn't start to go to those schools in any significant numbers and get out of them until 72, 73, 74. And so from that perspective, if we're 20 something then, it takes 30 years to essentially get to the C-suite, generally in most industries. So you're looking at 2000-ish is when you would have expected to see us emerge, and that's in fact what happened. Right. So that's not surprising. And then you would expect that the C-suite would start to, because our numbers really started to grow from there at these places, in the corporate world started to look a little more broadly at the HBCUs where we'd always gone. You'd expect the numbers to start to rise, right, of leaders at the very top, the senior leaders of corporate America. And that actually has happened. So a good barometer of that would be the Executive Leadership Council. So it's a group of Black leaders, CEOs, or within two reporting lines of the CEO of essentially Fortune, Russell 2000 type companies. And I joined ELC 30 years ago. There were probably about 70 people. Today, there's probably about, 400 or 500. And not all the folks that are eligible that in those ranks are in ELC. So that number has definitely exploded. What's not kept moving up is the number of those people that rise to the CEO job. You'd expect more, but it hasn't happened. And that's where it really starts to get to, the selection process is one. The boards are making these choices. It's a difficult choice to make. You're choosing people, none of whom are fully prepared for this job. They've done a lot of things, but they've got gaps. And so does the board feel like a Black person who has this gap is going to be able to overcome it by continue to learn or by building a team where somebody has strength in that gap area? And that's where I think the biases start to really make that filtering process a little bit more difficult than it should be.
Before we move on from kind of the business realm this way, I want to bring up the Red Lobster because it's been in the news quite a bit lately. And I know, and I don't want to get my facts incorrect. So in 2014, I believe that there was a negotiation taking place to sell Red Lobster. And there was some blowback from shareholders at the time about what was happening at Darden. Right. You were the CEO at that point. And Red Lobster ultimately did sell for a couple $2 billion. When you look back now at where Red Lobster is, not trying to evaluate why it ended up where it is, but looks like a pretty good deal to me from here. I wonder if it does to you.
It does. I mean, Red Lobster was the founding brand for Darden. And then Darden got sold to General Mills. Under General Mills, Olive Garden was developed. And then you fast forward 25 years and General Mills spins that out as a separate company. And so after the spin out, I joined right at the spin out. I was treasurer, then CFO. And we tried to, develop some more businesses the way we did at Olive Garden, mixed results. But then we started to acquire. And so we acquired Longhorn Steakhouse and Capitol Grill and Eddie V's and Yard House. Red Lobster was facing a structural challenge. So when Red Lobster started, seafood was reasonably priced, um, and it was democratizing seafood, if you will, able to bring it into the center of the country, off the coast, at affordable prices. And you know, its customer base was sort of middle class, working class. Fast forward, the world starts to get wealthier. The collapse of communism, even in countries that claim to be communist, embracing of market economies. So China is getting wealthier, Vietnam, all of these places where seafood is a core piece of the diet, and they're eating more and eating more seafood. So the cost of seafood is really on this upward trend. And it's difficult to see how Red Lobster's margins could hold up. When seafood costs are escalating, their customer base cannot afford that level of escalation. So it's a real squeeze. That's what we saw. And so we thought it best to move on. We had these other brands. We didn't really need Red Lobster to maintain scale because of the acquisitions we'd gotten. And so we were going to sell it. There were activists who, because of a, normal sort of slowdown in the business, were looking to get involved. So they seized on this sale and said, well, it ought to be subject to shareholder approval. We're like, it doesn't have to be. And that would just destroy this sale process. So we went on and sold it. And it was $2.2 billion. And it was the right thing to do. Looks like a great price because it's just continued to decline over that 10-year period about the way we had forecasted it. And so it was the right thing. I mean, what it really needs to do is shrink. It can't really perform the way it needs to perform in some of the neighborhoods it's in, given the income demos of those neighborhoods.
And huge stores. I know we had one in Naples during that $20 shrimp giveaway, and it must have been an 8,000 square foot store.
Big.
Yeah, no way to fill all those tables. Well, you see around corners, sir, as is often said. All right, let's move on. And although this may be a little bit out of your, I think it's still in your wheelhouse. So I want to dive into this a little bit. I've been consumed, Clarence, by the Sean Diddy Puppy Combs unraveling, downfall, nightmare that it's been. Every bit of it, from the elevator and the hotel tape to, just the overall tragedy, man. Of a young man who came up, where and how he did. His father worked for Frank Lucas, so no stranger to violence. Where he grew up, but he was 3, and his dad did get murdered. So you've got to understand a little bit of the backstory here to put in context what Diddy accomplished. But I want to talk specifically about something that I saw regarding, you mentioned the distributor Diageo, and how Diddy was challenging them on the way that they were marketing his tequila and vodka products, right? And that he felt that they were only trying to sell them to quote unquote urban communities or Black communities. And he did not want to be labeled as a quote unquote Black brand, that he felt he was a international icon, arguably at the time he was. And I took that, kind of and drilled down on that, because I've had this conversation with folks in our industry, post 2020, a lot of us felt the need to kind of plant the red, black, and green flag, and the black owned, and, maybe they're, and go back and forth as to whether or not that's advantageous. I always felt, Clarence, like, you're limiting a piece of the pie. If there's the whole pie, why do you only want this limited slice? Because to other folks, it may sound, well, it's exclusive. It's not for me. I'm curious, any of that take apart, but also to where you land on the value of labeling something
Yeah,
as
yeah.
Black owned.
I would agree with you that you are limiting the opportunity set. Um, you've got a brand. The brand has a certain soul to it, and
Hmm.
and spirit and vibe, and that may be Black informed, but that doesn't mean that that needs to be how it's marketed and expressed, because other people can plug into that vibe and that feel if they're invited in. And so to sort of talk about yourself as a Black brand and market into only Black channels, I think it's limiting for sure. So I look at something like Rihanna's brand, so everybody
Hmm.
knows that Rihanna's the muse, and so Black culture influences it, but that's not how she puts it out there. It's a brand for women,
Right.
you know,
Yep.
and it just has this kind of spin and essence to it, but you can tap into that too. And so I think that's the way to play it. I think even on ownership, a lot of people and the governments get caught up on this too, about being a Black owned business. Well, how are you going to grow if it's always got to be more than 50% Black owned? So you're limiting your
Hmm.
access to larger pools of capital. I think it's more important to me that you're Black controlled, or controlled by folks who understand and champion and the Black community than you're Black owned. I look at
Hmm.
Comcast. Brian Roberts controls Comcast, but Brian Roberts doesn't own a majority of Comcast, or else it would never have gotten to the scale it's got. I know what his ownership interest is, but it's probably less than 10%. That'd be my guess, but
Wow.
he still controls it. And
Hmm.
so you can
Hmm.
control the company without ownership, and that ownership piece really limits your access to capital, your ability to really get. I mean, Vista's not
Right.
a Black-owned company. It's a little different because they're general partners and limited partners, but Robert's got a bigger capital base.
And Clarence, I'm curious, just back to the Diddy saga for a moment. If you look at that through the lens of, having grown up in Los Angeles, I was there. I mean, you haven't grown up in LA, but I was there during the, late 80s, 90s and saw, the whole
Yeah.
Death Row saga and, all the musics that came out of New York and hip hop, and been a big fan. But I also see the downside. And I think Diddy represents, obviously, some problems with pop power, access, lack of discipline. What's your overview culturally about what we're witnessing in his downfall? Was there any big thing, macro thing that you see going on here that is symptomatic of what he's experiencing
Yeah,
now?
I do think it's, I think the entertainment business is one where it's easy for people to lose perspective, and you can be surrounded by people who idolize you and are sycophants, and they're not telling you the truth, and you're not seeing the larger picture. And it becomes all about you and this cult of personality. It surrounds you. And so you can begin to, your worst characteristics can begin to become enabled and told that
Mhm.
these are not bad things. These are typical. This is the way the world works. And that's how the entertainment business can be, whether it's music or film. And so I do
Mhm.
think that's part of it. Hollywood's always been that way. I mean, the bubble that exists there, they don't have any clue about how people are living in South LA day to day.
Mhm.
They're so absorbed and self-absorbed, and they feel like they're socially conscious. Go through all these things to try to demonstrate that. You know, Adopting kids from Africa and going to India, and you're like, man, just 8 blocks down the road. I know people that that I grew up with, that grew up in the city, they're in the music side of that equation, but almost nobody goes to the film and television side. I mean, the only person from Watts I can think of in that film and television world would be Tyrese. He might be it.
Interesting example. Yeah. Last couple of things. You are the chairman at Jazz at Lincoln Center. So I'm a jazz enthusiast with artists like Samara Joy, Gregory Porter, Kamasi Washington, and this Chilean artist I recently found out about, Melissa Aldana. Is jazz alive and well?
Well, it's a two-part answer. So from a performance perspective, for sure. I mean, you've got more, jazz music programs at conservatories and universities, and the talent level globally has never been better. I mean, it's just, and it's deeper than ever. You've got more and more women who are playing instruments, so they're not just vocalists. I mean, lots of them. Some of them are stars, superstars. So from a talent perspective and a performance perspective, from an audience perspective, in the U.S., the audience is really aging. It's struggled to get younger folks as enthusiasts. But that's not true outside the U.S. Outside the U.S., it thrives with younger people, and Asia and Europe. But the U.S., you've got an aging audience and struggle to get younger people to embrace the genre.
Read where you refer to yourself as a wordsmith, and I love that, man. And I think communication, Clarence, obviously listening, active listening is very important, as we all know. But the ability to say what you mean to say and communicate. You mentioned how people listened to you. They sought your advice, they sought your opinion, they sought your viewpoint, and they still do, and they listen to you. And I'm curious, from your point of view, what does it take to be such an effective communicator? Because you are. I mean, in all of the interviews that I've read, all of the times I've seen you on CNBC, you're economic with your words. I'm not. You say exactly what you mean to say. Your points are clear. I think you really have a unique ability. What do you attribute that to?
I think you have to listen to people. To communicate well, you have to put yourself in the other person's shoes. So you're listening to their perspective, but you're not just listening, you're trying to understand where it's coming from, who they are. And so then in responding to that, you've got to tailor your message so that, given who they are and the shoes area, they can hear it. And so what you say to people when you're trying to make the same point to two different people, you may say it slightly different ways. I think that's the key.
I love that. Great nuance. All right. And again, before I let you go, one more thing here. Crazy times, man. This election is insane. The most important one, we're being told, of our lifetime. Are you optimistic? You feeling okay about where we're headed?
Oh,
just generally?
yeah.
You think we're going to be all right?
I think so. I think a lot of the real craziness comes from a place of sort of just fear of a future that's pretty clear. I mean, you've got a future in this country that's going to be one where the folks who are setting the pace from a policy perspective, a social perspective, will be more diverse than ever. And there's no escaping it. I mean, those demographics are baked. And a lot of people fear that. And there's a backlash, but that backlash will be overwhelmed by the numbers, economically and politically. The numbers always, ultimately, will tell the tale.
Well, your family might not like me for saying this, but Clarence Otis for president. Your next JOB, man. Clarence, thank you so much for your time today, man. You've been very generous, and I really looked forward to this, and I thoroughly enjoyed talking
Thank you,
to you.
man.
Thank you so much.